Well, welcome to Chamber's Members' Lunch. It's been a little while since we've had one of these with the passing of the Queen and a short summer break, so great to see everyone in the room. I'm Laura Mccarroll, Director at Chamber of Commerce, and I can see some new faces and perhaps some of those joining us as guests who are not yet Chamber members. So if I explain a little bit about what we try and do with these monthly lunches, it's really an opportunity for us to bring an experts, as you see today, into the room to talk about a topic which is of great interest and often great importance to the island as a whole. So a really big thank you to the panelists for taking time out to speak to us today, and for Rollo de Sausmarez, who will be moderating this session. A quick explanation about how the format's going to work. So we'll be starting off with a panel discussion. I think Rollo will be opening to questions throughout, but then we'll be pausing for lunch to ensure you do get fed, and resuming for a more dedicated Q&A session at the end. So you might have time to formulate your questions at that point. A big thank you to Islands Insurance for supporting this series throughout the year. They've really allowed us to continue with these really important events and to keep these conversations going. For your interest, the next two events, we've actually got two coming up in November. So we've got November 21st, we'll have Martin Doré talking to us about the cost of living crisis, followed closely by the Lieutenant Governor, who's joining us on the 28th. So do look out for those events. I'm going to pass on swiftly to Rollo because I'm in the knowledge that we've got a lot to cover today. So thank you, everybody.
Hello and welcome to the event. My name is Rollo de Sausmarez. I'm a strategic advisor with a focus on sustainability mainly at a business called Unity, but I'm also the co-lead of the Chamber of Commerce's Sustainable Business Initiative along with Jennifer Strachan. I'm really keen to foster debate and discussion on how we can best accelerate the transition to the green economy. And it's excellent to have a packed house for this event, which I think underlines the importance of this topic right now. We live in troubled times. The word crisis is bandied around increasingly over the last few years and even more in the last few months. The housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, and of course, the climate crisis all have some of their solutions tied up within the built environment. To solve the housing crisis, we're certainly going to need more housing. And to make an impact on the other crises, that housing needs to be cost-effective, sustainable, and energy efficient. Oh, and the clock is ticking. There are very real economic and environmental and political consequences for the island if we drag our feet. The Sustainable Business Initiative has been planning this event for some time. Our objectives can be summarized as: we want to highlight the complexity and the interrelated number of stakeholders required to drive a more sustainable approach to construction. And it's amazing to have the people on the panel and you in the audience, because I really value Guernsey's expertise in this area. We want to get some expert perspectives on ways of driving change and overcoming the challenges and barriers for the future. Because then we'll move in the right direction. And also, as with all these chamber events, we want to increase and strengthen the island's knowledge and strengthen networks, because again, that's how stuff gets done. So today, we'll be questioning a panel made of some of Guernsey's most influential and knowledgeable experts in the sector to help us understand how we change the game. As a sustainability advisor, I know it's a multifaceted problem to solve. I've spoken to some of you in the audience about this, and you've given me your perspective, so thank you very much. But what we need, therefore, is a panel, and of course, some of the expertise in the audience to help unpick it. We're very lucky to have four great panelists here today. Victoria Oliver is President of Development and Planning Authority, and she's also a qualified chartered surveyor, so she has a number of perspectives to bring to the table on this. John Bampkin is the Chief Executive of the NP Group and Chairman of Guernsey Construction Forum. John has 41 years, which seems unreal, looking at his fresh face, of supplying building materials and into construction markets. So we have that perspective too. Richard Spinney in the middle here is Director of Henderson Green, and his particular area of expertise and interest is the design and engineering services in buildings and building energy usage. And then on the end, we have Paul Langlois of Paul Langlois Architects. Paul is a chartered architect with particular interest in passive solar design and in buildings. So we've heard from we've heard about the running order, and so we're going to carry on until 1. I'm going to be asking some questions of the panel, and we'll get some answers. If there's an area that you'd like to pile in on, then please put your arm up. We have a roving mic that will come and find you. You have to speak into the microphone, otherwise it won't go on our live stream, which would be horrific, and no one hear your input. So hands up for those kind of things. So I think we'll probably start. I've spoken for too long already, which is often the way. Okay, so the first question I'd like to put to the panel, and indeed the wider audience, is what are the main barriers to more sustainable construction in Guernsey when we consider planning, availability of materials, information on sustainability of materials, familiarity or expertise in using those sustainable materials and techniques, client demand? What are the biggest blockers and what can we do to overcome them? So Paul, can I come to you on that one to start with?
I'd say all of the above, actually. I think sustainability is a whole integral package of things, not just one thing or the other. And it has to be all joined up and understood, right from the type of sites we're using, from brownfield sites to the design of the buildings, the materials that are being used, and the end user, how it's being used, and then its long life, end of life cycle, and how those materials can be regenerated or reused. So it's a bigger picture than just one element of blockage. But there's certain things that could ease it in terms of planning and building control issues and making that easier for those sort of buildings to get through. And then just a general education for the general public on what's meant by sustainability and how we can achieve it.
So we've got an interconnected problem here, which is often the way. It's never simple, and we go into this knowing that that's the case. One of the potential ways to overcome them is through planning. So over to Victoria on perhaps on her perspective on that.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I think that it is, as Paul said, it is looking at all of them. I know from a planning aspect, we're constantly trying to improve things and remove some of the barriers. So one of the things that really stuck out with us with sustainability and energy performance was that you're still having to apply for solar panels and not always in the right direction. So we've got the new exemptions coming out, and that theoretically, touch wood, the legislation will be approved in February. So that will make things a lot easier for people to apply for an energy performance sort of related things. So insulation for your house that currently needed planning permission, and it won't now. I think also a lot of people look at the building control regs as that's a target they need to get to, whereas actually that's a minimum standards that we should be building to. And I think it's getting actually a big barrier is actually changing people's thoughts and how they actually come about this, because I know a lot of them sort of go, oh, sustainability, it's just going to cost me more. And some things will cost more, but there are small things that you can do which will make a big difference. And it's trying to get that sort of built in the culture of what we do.
Okay, excellent. So we've got some change coming along the tracks, which is really exciting, around the planning exemptions, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in due course through the media. Jonathan, from a construction materials perspective, do you see that as a barrier to change at the moment?
No, not really, because we get most of our materials from the UK or from Europe, and they're already more advanced than we are on most of these subjects. So apart from the recent issues around COVID, Brexit, blocked ships in the canal, and now the Ukraine war, apart from those small things,
just a few things.
Supply's been quite easy. But no, on a more serious note, it's definitely eased and things have returned back to normal. And most of the products that we're talking about are readily available and being used on a daily basis in the UK.
Great. And Richard, do you think that we have the techniques here? Do people have the expertise to use these new materials?
Certainly. I mean, it takes as much effort to put 4 inches of insulation into a wall as it does 2 inches of insulation. So, we're not talking about very significant changes. We're just talking about doing more of the same things. But I think the biggest blocker for my side of things is actually people having the knowledge of what is the most sustainable material. You know, if no matter where you go on the internet, you can find someone saying steel's best, concrete's best, timber's best. But actually it's finding out what the truth is and doing more work on that.
Okay, brilliant. Is there anyone from the audience who wants to chime in on that broad question around the barriers and blockers of construction? Yeah, at the back there.
We've got a lot of nervousness in the market over new products, in my mind, and techniques of building that potentially are solving problems elsewhere, but there's a reluctance here to adopt them. Where they've been adopted, without wanting to tread on any legal matters, but where they've been adopted, there have been issues in early adoption, which have caused, I think, nervousness in the market from an insurance and a lending point of view. So in my view, it's not just the aspirations of those that want to build, it's also the other mechanisms within the provision of building processes, the insurance market and the lending market that also need to get on board with something a little bit more experimental in terms of that. And also, we have a little bit of a barrier in so much as we don't have a good education system on the island for local contractors to be able to bring their skills with new materials and the like up to standard very easily. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that it's typically involves going off island on training courses and the like, which can be very difficult. I wonder if it's time for Guernsey to sit at the forefront of building innovation rather than following a number of years behind by encouraging research establishments to come and take advantage of our extreme coastal environment where building materials and building elements could be tested to the extreme, and actually bring the knowledge here so that Guernsey becomes perhaps experts in the field rather than, as John was saying, other people being well in advance of us and us simply importing the end product rather than being the creators, because we have all of the problems to an extreme compared to many other jurisdictions, but we are accessible, we're on the shipping lanes, etc. We can get access to the bigger players in this marketplace geographically. And it just seems to me to be an opportunity that we could take on board if we accept that there's an experimental nature to solving this problem and we can't just pick a solution off a shelf that somebody else has already done. That's my addition to this part.
Thank you very much. So there's a perspective there about Guernsey aspiring to be a leader in this space and using our unique situation to take advantage of that. I suppose that maybe segues quite nicely onto a question here around the materials. So we talked a little bit about the materials and how that's important. And John touched on how it's actually quite hard for people to really know what is absolutely the best material. So when we're looking at choosing sustainable and energy efficient construction materials, should retailers and contractors do more to educate the public on their choices, and how might that take place? So I'll start with Paul on that one, as he's not selling building materials right now, but we will come to John on that one as well.
Yes, I mean, going back to the point made, I think in Guernsey, maybe generally, there's still a slight stigma attached to timber frame building for various reasons and bad construction in the kind of 80s and stuff. But that seems to be the way to go in many ways, although people still like the solidity of the block building here. But there is an education requirement, and people are becoming more and more aware of everything in construction and design, really. And if you go to Northern Piette, they've got a nice mock-up of a 6-panel house. And it's those sort of things when you can sort of touch and see what is available that makes you think, well, okay, maybe that's the way forward. And as time goes on, it'll become more and more appropriate to go down that route, I think.
Okay, brilliant. And John, you know, you're there on the coalface selling the materials. Is it quite hard to communicate both the sustainability and the energy efficiency of the materials you're selling?
I don't think it's difficult to communicate. We basically do it when we get asked the question. So, do the suppliers and the manufacturers have more responsibility to educate people using those products? Yes, we probably do. As Paul said, we have got a huge mock-up building there already, and we can talk anybody through any of those sort of things. But there are lots and lots of training courses available. I think Ollie's made a very good point about let's get some more of those over on Guernsey. We've just taken on a new sales manager who's actually an expert in solar. So, we've recognised that we need to keep adding to our knowledge base in the team. But, all the information's there, all the knowledge is there. It's just waiting to be tapped into, really. And I think a lot of our trade customers take advantage of that, but maybe some non-trade customers don't. So I think for all of us, it's a subject that we can all educate ourselves on. And I'm guessing most people in this room are already interested in the subject, so know a fair bit about it, more than the average. But I think there's a lot of information out there that's all readily available, and we've all got a responsibility to keep educating ourselves on that. And certainly the contractors have a big responsibility, as again, as Ollie says, learning new products and new ways of building is tough. So they have a lot to do there. But I think, yes, the industry could certainly get a lot more joined up. Maybe it's something for the Guernsey Construction Forum and the GBTA to take away and see how we do that. So I think there's more to do.
Great, thank you. Victoria, did you want to come in that one as well?
I think this needs to be split into two parts, actually, because you have sustainable products, but then you also have the carbon footprint. So logistically, Guernsey is going to have a higher carbon footprint because we need to get in the materials from wherever. And I think that looking at the carbon footprint, you're going to have to sort of like, there's places where you can get things which are much more actually sustainably produced, built, look at, and are much easier to dispose of. Whereas you've got other products that could be, especially materials that look sort of very sustainability on the front of it because of the high energy performance things. And that's where I think I would say a lot more education actually needs to come through this. I know whenever we have new look at sort of new regulations come in, we always make sure that we speak to Skills Guernsey and ESC to say, can we actually fit this education in to make sure we actually keep up with the times? And I think that changing a system of education, it really lags behind. And I think that's a huge barrier actually to the changing and making sure we do keep up.
That's really interesting perspective. Well, okay, John, and then we'll go to Richard on that.
If I can just quickly add to that as well. So just to put some more meat on the bones in terms of the life cycles. So there's 4 elements to that. The first element is the production of the actual materials. So you've got a carbon footprint there. Second element is the chain of supply. So how do you get it to site to be used? The third element is then how does that product perform in the life of that building? So over the 50, 60 years, is it energy efficient? Does it reduce the carbon footprint? And then the fourth element is then what happens to that product when you come to demolish it, or can you reuse it, or does it have to go to landfill? So they're the 4 elements to that carbon footprint. Okay,
so we've got a few different things there. So I'm conscious I haven't come to Richard on this one, and he's got great expertise in this area. I mean, particularly when we're looking at there's the sustainability of the material itself, and there's also the carbon footprint. How important is it when we're measuring these things to take the whole life emissions into account when we're looking at materials and construction methods? Richard, yeah.
Massively, I think, and I think the ball is in the court of the architect. That when a client wants a job built, the first person they go and knock on the door of is the architect. So our architects need to be, and a lot of them are, as up to date as they can be on what is the most sustainable construction, what are the lowest energy materials, and they're doing the detailing in most instances of how to include those in a client's building. So I think it's getting architects up to speed, keeping up to speed.
So we're seeing like a lot of interconnectedness again. It's going to be a theme that we come back to here. Paul, what's your perspective?
Well, it's interesting because when I studied architecture in the early 80s, I don't recall the word sustainable being mentioned at all. And now my son's studying architecture, and it's a massive part of the course. And within the field, there's people who devote their whole lives expertise to it. So it's heading in the right direction, but it's just getting that sort of trickle down to people on site, to the general public, to know that this is the way forward and it is achievable without huge cost. And that's why my perspective on passive solar design. I feel it's just a way of designing a building to utilize solar energy, natural ventilation, natural light, rather than thinking, okay, it's all costs a lot, it's gonna add 10% more to the building. There's ways to deal with it.
Okay, brilliant. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to come in on this bit around construction materials, their sustainability, and how we measure them? So if we could have the mic down here, if we could bear with us a second. We've got to navigate the maze.
Rollo, if I can just jump in, I mean, the actual cost of building a house, for example, 20% of you take the bathroom and kitchen out of it, probably only 20% of that is materials.
Okay,
So it doesn't necessarily have to add massively to the cost of running.
okay. So huge impact sustainably, but small impact cost-wise. Far away.
Planning stage, are there any advantages to going with a sustainable plan versus a non-sustainable one? So if you had an application, is that given extra points, if you like? Is that more likely to go through? Is there anything within that kind of planning system to encourage the sustainability at the plan stage?
And will it change?
So whenever you look at a planning application, it's not just the sustainability, you look at the design, you look at the sort of like the bulking of the property. And I think that whenever you're looking, I'm going to take it back because I'm not a qualified planner, but whenever I look at it, do open planning meetings, I always look at it as some scales. So if you've got really good sustainability, then that sort of like puts the scales up. Then you look at all the other things. So you look at the design and then you work out where the scales come. So if you have excellent everything, then it's just going to be a straightforward pass. But if you don't have sustainability, that's a negative side of it. So that sort of goes against it a little bit. And then you've got to take in everything else that goes with it. So it is a balancing act, but if you have really good sustainability, it's going to become it's a positive anyway.
Yeah, and planning are absolutely the definition of a balancing act, I think. But it sounds like the takeout is that if you do your planning application with all the good things in, including sustainability,
Yeah.
then they'll have a greater chance of getting through. Is there any kind of specific changes that we think are coming around the planning regs or anything next year, or is that?
It's the planning regs that are going to come in next quarter. There'll be sort of like much higher levels of sort of everything really, and it's looking at what England have got and taking it here. But I would say, and I will reiterate this, the planning regulations are just the minimum standards, and yet in Guernsey we do look at them as right, that's the target to beat. Whereas we've got many developers actually going in above and beyond, and that's where we really all should actually be.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Just Rollo, within the planning application, you do have to say
There's a sustainability
clause
statement.
about sustainability of the building. Now, with the extension of curtilage, you have to say how that land is going to be used and sustainable and biodiversity.
Okay, so and biodiversity is something that comes up a lot and increasingly in these kind of sustainability conversations. So I'm going to move on to a different subject now. Oh, sorry.
I just had one question on the point about the standards being a minimum. In order to encourage people to invest beyond the minimum, you need that value, that additional value to be reflected in house prices so that developers and homeowners are motivated to actually put these systems in and not end up getting paid the same price of the house as if they had gone to the minimum. What can be done in terms of the housing market to ensure that there's better quality information and hopefully an embedment of the sustainability aspect in the value of properties?
Okay, so Victoria, do you want that one? Or, and then Richard?
I think that kind of goes on to one of the other questions, but I think that I know that if I was going to buy a house and there was two houses, one had like I'd probably in a better position than most because I can see, but if one has better energy performance, I will hands down in the same price. I will go for that one any day. So it's the markability of it, and I think that like if you take what England have got, they've got EPCs, energy performance certificates, which actually really inform the person purchasing the property what performance that property is. And I know that is something that we're looking at. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we are looking at it within the department.
Okay, Richard, do you want to comment?
I was going to make the point about the EPCs because it's very difficult looking at a building to say, has it got 10 inches of insulation in the wall or none? And by having the EPC, it's there in your face to say this is a grade A building compared to a grade B building.
So energy performance certificates are they're pretty much required in most of our competitor jurisdictions as well. So it's not just the UK; it's in Jersey and Isle of Man, and transactions can't take place unless there's certain levels there. So it sounds like EPCs might harmonise some of the approach to some of these things, and maybe they might not raise the price, but maybe they'll lower the price for people who don't meet those requirements over there. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. I'm really glad to see that EPC might be introduced over here. I think that's extremely good news. The question I actually had was more around solar panels, because it seems to be there's almost a disincentive to put solar panels in place. So I wondered if that was going to change.
Okay. Who would like that one? Is that one for you, Victoria? Or?
Well, we have the exemptions coming out. The legislation will be completed in Touchwood February, and that has huge incentives to put solar panels, batteries, the Tesla batteries, or whatever type of battery you want, and other items. And you will no longer need planning application for that. So that's sort of like trying to encourage people to say, you know, you can do that. We're making it easier. We're trying to streamline it. And a lot of people don't want to be going to planning just to put a solar panel on the roof. So we're trying to make it easier. We're just trying to make the planning department much more streamlined and easier to use.
So on that point, so it's going to become easier to do it, but I don't think you mean you're going to be incentivizing at a government level, are you?
At the moment, not. We have
No.
the energy strategy coming towards us soon, and that will be looking at things in a lot more detail. I have had a presentation on it, but I don't think it's public knowledge at the moment. I'm not too sure. So just in case.
So let's stay with the solar, and we'll stay with not necessarily solar, but renewables and incentives. When I've looked at different jurisdictions, they have different policy levers in place that encourage behaviour that the jurisdiction would like to happen. Talking to the panel, but also opening out to the audience a little bit later, are there places around the globe that we're doing it particularly well in kind of encouraging and incentivizing? And are there things that we could learn from that? Anyone on the panel would like to? Richard, do you want to comment on that?
Well, the one big disincentive is if GE change their tariff structure to make unit cost of electricity lower and the standard rate higher, that will massively change the payback periods for things like solar panel. So the more expensive energy is, the more likely people are going to invest in energy saving measures.
Okay.
Because I think one of the main talking to clients, a lot of them are looking at alternative air source heat pumps or solar panels just because they want to get off the oil track, and so that in itself is an incentive, and especially with energy prices rising, the payback time is becoming less, which is another question they often ask: how long will it take to pay back? So it's all being channeled into the right sort of direction.
Sorry, one thing, you know, if we look at ourselves, if GHA are a shining light, you know, for years they've been building incredibly energy efficient houses with the heat recovery ventilation systems. They used to put the solar panels on, but that we are actually doing an awful lot right here. And if we can do it right at the bottom end of the market, there's no excuse why anyone else can't do it right.
Okay, Victoria, you wanted to come on that one as well, didn't you?
I think also it's not just about the solar, it's also about sort of like insulation, because now insulation will no longer need a planning application as well. And I know that people sort of, whenever you talk about, so especially with the EPCs, look at the main core first. And I know Scotland, they just did a grant and said that they could basically, if you're going to look at the house, if you want to insulate it, they'll give it a grant. Whereas the UK looked at it and sort of said, actually, we want some evidence to see what you're doing. So off the EPCs, they then said, well, if you can get it up a few grades, then you can get sort of green finance and look at it like that. Whereas we are lagging behind, I think, in Guernsey of that. But then, as Richard said, if you've got the lower end of the market doing it already, surely it should just come up.
Going out to the hive mind there, are there any jurisdictions or any interesting examples of case studies of people doing it well that the audience know of, that they want to come in on?
I would just say that getting over 50 years ago, I had a huge grant towards cavity insulation in the UK. And that was available to anybody who wanted to take it up. And certainly I think at about the same time too, friends of mine had some sort of subsidy for some of their solar panels which were being put in. And they, of course, must have been paid for over and over again by now. So it is something that I think the states should be considering, because although the GHA may be a good example, those people who own their own properties and who may not be very wealthy would certainly benefit from some sort of subsidy from the states to ensure that their energy efficiency was of the highest level.
Okay, and over at the back there, I don't know. Yeah, go for it. So just in the interim, Victoria's going to come in on that one.
I couldn't agree more, but unfortunately finances at the moment are always a bit of an issue. However, I think there's always ways around things, and I know that we're doing a lot of work at the moment. We're looking at sort of like how to sort of actually the current home, sort of like how to improve it. We've got 27,000 houses roughly on the island. 1,600 are protected buildings, and you're getting roughly on average about 100 new builds a year. So it's actually taking those remaining houses and looking at them. Anything sort of like from 2010 you can just rule out, because their energy performance is pretty good, but it's all the ones before, especially like 1930s and 40s and 50s, like they're the ones actually that really need the target. So I think if we were going to do something like a grant for that, you'd have to target it on the worst houses, and those would be the age range that you would look at to do something.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I don't work for GE, obviously, but I'm going to pitch GE's case on the solar side of things in terms of domestic renewables, just because there is a matter of security of supply. And obviously we at the moment buy our electricity in from France through the cable. There's the states have an objective, as I understand, to generate renewables on island, which is fantastic. But if the states is generating renewables and we're buying energy from France, if individuals are allowed to develop their own domestic systems, which is either subsidized or taking the demand out from the main grid, it does leave the rest of the populace that aren't able to afford to invest in that technology at a bit of a loss. I appreciate in the long term, it's a very, very admirable strategy. But in the short term, we need to understand that there are economies of scale to living on an island. And it's not just a case of saying, okay, so John's going to do his renewables and everybody else can go hang. It's a difficult scenario to be in. I'd also just say on the EPC question as well, it is a very valuable system and I completely support it. I worked in the UK when it was introduced around about the mid-2000s. The difficulty with Guernsey, I think, is that, I mean, if you run the transactions, I don't know, there's probably about 1,000 property transactions in a year, something like that. These EPCs are done for between 50 and 130 pounds in the UK. That's a building surveyor or a specialist surveyor going out and doing it. Now, if you've got 1,000 transactions at 130 pounds, it's 130,000 pound revenue in a year. You've got 7 or 8 building surveying practices who are going to split that up. And they're looking at possibly having a divvy up of about 20,000 pounds income per year. And that's on the light side. There are far more building surveyors, I'd say, than that. You're looking at an income of about 20,000 pounds. Now, to do that, you've got to train somebody, send them away to do it, etc. It's a big commitment for potentially a very small benefit, because we are a very small jurisdiction. We only have a very limited number of properties, and we only have a very limited number of people. And so to put in these measures. I think building control in the past have been very sensible in actually not engaging with a lot of the more technical demands that the UK building control system requires, because it requires such a huge investment of time and effort. Richard, you mentioned about architects being top of the game. I totally agree, but somebody's got to pay for it. And it's got to come in somewhere along the line as somebody's investment. And, we can keep on top of regulations and be the very best, but if we're not doing it as a jurisdiction as a whole, and we're relying on individuals to make that investment on the speculative return, I think that's a big ask. So that's just a bit of a balance to what's been spoken about so far.
Okay, thank you very much, Ollie. There's quite a lot in there actually to unpack, I think. So there's a bit about the ensuring that policies aren't regressive when it comes to looking after the poorest in society, when it comes to transition to the green economy, and the costs of the network changes for Guernsey electricity to bill players who are still there, not with the solar there. We also have this piece around the EPCs. On the one hand, you have standardization with other jurisdictions. On the other hand, you have extra regs and challenges, and maybe not, from Ollie's perspective, maybe not a huge slice of upside to that. Does anyone on the panel have a perspective around EPCs that might, talk to that?
In the UK, how it works is you get companies who develop a business solely around the EPCs. So it's not spread around every building surveyor. If you are trying to sell a house in the UK and you need an EPC, you go online and you find someone who'll do it for 150 quid.
So the scale of the market drives competition in a normal way is perhaps the takeout from Richard there. So there's a few things around EPCs that have come out that sound like something that needs some prodding out from a general perspective. Let's maybe move to another question, if that's all right. What should we do next? So here's a nice thorny one, which I know everyone will get fired up. So Guernsey has finite space. We live in a beautiful place, but there's only so much of it. Is more verticality in construction projects a way for growing our housing stock without encroaching on green space? So maybe put that to architects to start with, Paul.
I think there's this time and place for high-rise buildings, but it depends what you call high-rise. We don't want to turn some people into Monte Carlo, but there are areas where, like the Shrottery, where maybe you could have a building of a certain height without being detrimental to the acting on the environment. I think the other thing is that obviously there's, again, this stigma to high-rise in terms of issues, social issues that have come about over years. But if you're putting the right people in there, rather than families who want to be on the ground floor and have a garden, etc., then it's a question of getting the right people into that building.
So maybe part of the solution. Victoria, you want to come in on that one?
Well, the IDP within the main centre supports high rise. And I think that where we're actually sort of almost not doing it justice is that people that say, all right, we can have high rise and then we can actually get more property on there. Whereas what we should be doing is saying we can have high rise, but actually what we need is better amenities around it, more public space, looking at sort of maybe putting provisions for family orientated things, so parks and everything, and using the space that you've actually sort of gained by the high rise to actually improve the area, rather than having really high density scattered sort of go up and then make a better use of the space around. And I just don't think that's actually happening at the moment. But within the design GPA 8, we say, and I'm just going to say, the island development supports the provision of taller buildings at appropriate locations within the main centres. So I don't know where this disconnect is from developers or architects or something, because we've got such a small island. We need to start going up. We can't just sort of spreading out all the time. So I would welcome higher rise buildings.
I understand at Fontaine that the planners were saying you can go actually higher
Yeah.
than they've done.
And I understand when you go higher, you're going to need different things. If you go above 3 floors, you're going to start needing lifts, you're going to start needing better fire exits and everything like that. Structurally, it's slightly more, deeper foundations and everything like that. It does become a little bit more expensive. Over 5 floors, you need a proper sprinkler system and everything. But I just think we need to start using our land better. And I know GP10 sort of talks about making sure that it's sort of using the land to the maximum capacity and making sure that we use the land sensibly. But I just think we need to start thinking a little bit differently. And I would really welcome, the planners are going to be like, what? No, don't do that, Vicky, but put in higher applications and see where it goes.
Richard,
So,
comment on that?
yeah, from a numbers point of view, if one man's floor becomes another man's roof and vice versa, you're building a 6-sided box and 4 of those sides can be internal, so they have no heat loss. So compared to detached dwelling, then your heat loss is probably a quarter.
Okay.
So from an energy usage point of view, it makes lots of sense. From a materials point of view, again, one person's roof is another man's floor, that's less concrete or whatever you build it from.
Timber frame.
Or timber frame.
So I'm hearing the case for a little bit more verticality, but with the proviso for ensuring that the community investment in the community around it and the amenities for living, and if carefully managed with the right people and mix there, then there might well be a solution for more sustainable, higher density housing on the island without too much sprawl. Hopefully not reading too much into those answers already. Yes, we just need to get you a microphone.
Just sticking with high rise. Paul, actually, this is a question to you. I think one of the things that alarms some people, myself included, is the idea of lots of hideous high rise buildings that look that do not do anything for the environment. Can you tell me what options there are for architects who have a limited budget, presumably, to build things that are visually interesting and exciting?
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
No, I agree. There's been some monstrosities in there, but there's also been some really nice high-rise buildings that we could be proud of. And I think it's just a question of, again, it's educating architects and planners as to what will sit comfortably within that space. And as I was saying, you don't necessarily want them sticking out at a high level on flat land. There's valleys and areas and lowland where you can place them. So going back to the amenity space around it, yeah, that's something, well, the whole 20th century since high-rise came into being, architects have been trying to utilize that space around it. And often it's neglected, and it's a question of maintenance of that space and the security of that space, which is important. So yes, they can be made attractive.
Okay, Victoria, and then we'll go to John.
I think with design with high rise, you just have to look at Singapore. Singapore have done some amazing high rise. They've got living walls, they've got art all the way up. And I think that's something that would just be great. I'd love to see a living wall on a high rise. That would just be fantastic in Guernsey. But whether that happens to money and everything, that's different.
Yeah, I was going to add the living walls to it.
Yeah.
Victoria's absolutely right on that. I mean, that's a massive sustainability tick, if that's what you want to call it. But there's also great progress now on much more lightweight cladding materials and facades for buildings that also have some thermal efficiencies as well. So I think the technology is really moving forward now in some of these products, and they're composite materials. They don't lose their shape. They don't lose their colour. They still look good after 20 years after they've been put in place. So there's big progress being made, certainly over the last 3 or 4 years that I've seen, and that's continuing.
So we're hearing there about these green materials, green walls of growing stuff up and down the buildings, and there's some very striking examples out there which Victoria alludes to. And I understand from a technical perspective, they provide both the green lung in a built-up area. They also help insulate, as well as being aesthetically pleasing and ironing these things out. I think when I was posed the question about verticality, I think people always have an idea of a certain height in their head when that kind of question arises. And you know, I think what I'm talking about, and I think what the panel is touching on, is not a skyscraper. We're talking about going up, you know, 4 or 5 floors rather than 2 or 3, or 6 or 7 floors rather than 1 or 2. Those type of things, just for perspective. Okay. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to come in on that one before we move on? Yeah. So hang on for the mic, please, mate.
I agree with the comments about the concept of verticality and high quality open space around those buildings. As things stand today, we've got large agglomerations of protected land that is largely not available to the public and not available to development, and therefore it can't be used for that purpose. How would you see a transition to kind of vision that you set out?
The states have got a lot of land, and I know that we're in talks with a number of people. We've got land at the back of Belgrave Fontaine Vinery, and it's not, you couldn't build on it. It's well, you could, but you'd have to change a lot of levels to do that, in order to do that. And I know we're talking about sort of looking at maybe changing that actually within the IDP to open space, public open space, and sort of like getting the likes of sort of Edible Guernsey in to come and sort of look at it, changing some of it to the back of it, changing to some of it to allotments or something, and actually making it much more sort of user-friendly for the public, and to see whether you have picnic areas and stuff. But there's a lot of land in Guernsey, and I know that people always say the bridge is very, very dense, but it's ribbon development. If you look behind that, there's a lot of open space, but it's not open space that's actually accessible, that can be seen. And I think that's where we need to do quite a lot of work through planning to actually, and through economic, environment and infrastructure as well, to work together to actually bring a plan forward to actually make it more accessible and make land used. Okay, brilliant. Well, we're just going to pause there because I'm being looked at because it's past 1 o'clock. But Jonathan, I've noted your question. We'll come back to you after lunch, and we've got a few more really thorny questions to tackle after lunch. So talk amongst yourselves. Hope we've started the debate here. Enjoy the amazing lunch the OGH offers, and then we'll come back for more of this type of format, but maybe with a little bit more onus on you, the audience, to give us your perspectives. Thank you very much. We telegraphed at the beginning that there's a lot to cover today, so I'm really keen that we carry on with that, and I know that some of you are too. So we're going to go straight back into it. Same format as before, so we're going to have the roving mic going around. So if there's a burning question, we'll come to you. I think perhaps Jonathan, we go to Jonathan at the beginning. Jonathan, are you ready for your question?
I think I forget what it's called now, but the grading system for selling houses is an excellent idea, but I do fear it's overkill for such a small island, and plays to the economies of scale points that Ollie was making earlier.
That's EPC.
Yeah, EPC, yes. So I think whatever we do, we need to be proportionate to Guernsey. Our 65,000 people needs to be absolutely right for us. And whilst there might be some really nice things we could do, it needs to be proportionate to the island's population and the affordability of it. And maybe something like that is actually on a voluntary basis. And if you're in a competitive housing market, that might work. You know, if your house has got an A rating, the other house doesn't, well, then you might stand a better chance. But frankly, at the moment, you can put anything on the market, and well, subject to the last 3 weeks, it would probably sell pretty quickly anyway. The other point was just on, I like Victoria's analogy of having her scales, and it's just really, we can sell you some scales actually if you want some scales, but it's just really how do you feed that sort of mindset into the civil servant team, if you like, who are basing decisions based on a rule book, and things seem to be very black and white, and they don't often seem to see the sort of the bigger picture, whether it's a commercial bigger picture or a sustainability bigger picture. It's frustrating, and people will spend a lot of money not getting very far, and frankly move on.
So there's a question there about the subjectivity and walking the tightrope between the regulations and desired outputs. that planning do every day. So Victoria, over to you on that one.
The planners themselves they were reading what we've got for protected buildings, and they were taking quite a hardline view on it, which is absolutely fine and probably the right thing to do. But as a committee, we were saying, well, hold on a minute, especially with some of the units in towns that are just getting quite dilapidated, we'll take a much easier view on that. And we'll feed back to the director of planning, and then the director of planning take it to the planners themselves. So that initiative directly got passed down. Now, we didn't change anything within there because everything that's written within the IDP, it can be read quite flexible. So that's the way we sort of like did that. But there's pros and cons for everything, because I know I get so many emails about windows. It's unbelievable, and especially protected building windows. Now, we've had a number of experts come in, and I was really hoping actually they'd be poles apart, but they were exactly the same. They were saying that if you have a protected building with their window, actually a wooden sash window is better, and there are things that you can do to it to make it much improved, but it is lower carbon than a PVC window. Rightly or wrongly, that was what the committee took that advice, and we went with that. But things that are commercially sort of, especially some of the units within town, some of them are protected buildings, we do say to planners, look at it with an economic hat on as well, not just a sustainability, a protected building hat.
I'm not sure that always happens, and I'd just suggest that actually there's probably too many listed buildings, and often the entire building gets listed when actually, you know, the frontage might be of historic interest. Everything behind it was rebuilt in the early 90s, for an example, and actually, you know, there should be greater flexibility around that.
So on Guernsey, we currently have 1,600 listed properties. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not actually, I would say it's quite proportionate for that area, but I completely understand. And with my taking off my sort of presidency of DPA hat on and looking as a surveyor, listing is sometimes a real pain, because there is a higher bar to set. It doesn't mean that you can't do anything. It just means that you need to jump through a few more hoops. And when you've got sort of pressures with the increase in materials and everything like that, it's just another pressure to add to it. So we have tried to relax it within town.
Yeah, I think if we want to get town to that live, work and play space, we need another 5,000 people in the square mile. That does mean vertical development, and that can't happen with lots of small buildings that are sort of all listed, or some are listed and some have. There's ownership as well, which is another issue. But
just recently, we've actually it's been the first listed property that has ever been given permission to actually been knocked down. So we're not looking at the hard fast rule. We are saying it's got to be commercially viable, and there's many things you can do with protected buildings that I just think it's an actual education thing.
Okay, so we've got some things to think about there. Can we go to Nick Joyce at the back, who might have a perspective on some of this?
Hello, I deal with listed buildings for the States. I'm conservation and design. And it was just to say that we've done a project relatively recently to review the protected buildings in town, where we reviewed hundreds of buildings, had a short list of 40 buildings and managed to take off maybe, I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but we took about 10 buildings off the list in the centre of town. And that's because the government work plan identified the regeneration areas as that. And in order to help that, we've studied those buildings. So where we couldn't take the buildings off the list because they didn't meet the criteria, we explained why they are special, so that then that can help people to in the regeneration of them. Because they understand what's special, they can save that. So it's just to say that we have done some work on that and removed quite a few buildings.
So maybe a more nuanced approach seems to be taking place around planning and sustainability and considerations and retrofitting to older buildings. But you know, there's always going to be a tension there. I see that. So, does anyone else on the panel want to come in on any of those things around listed buildings and the like, and the tension with sustainability?
I would only say, comparing a sash window to PVC, you should compare a sash window to a timber double glazed window, not a, if you want PVC, have a sash PVC to a sash, sash PVC to a sash paste.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, Paul,
Just a slight aside, I remember about 15 years ago, it's a future development, and he was talking about thermal mass, great to have, but then have it like addition.
Yeah.
Okay, then disperse it through the building. I remember someone came up to me and said, "Well, he's just described the Guernsey farmhouse with the binary on the side." And it's true when you look at the Guernsey farmhouse in terms of sustainability, it's perfect. The granite was from the side, the roof was from the braid of owl thatch roof, and it's all recyclable. And I think that's how we have to see protected buildings, is that they're not pickled in aspic, and they have to be able to grow and be repurposed and regenerated.
okay, interesting. So we moved along there to our existing traditional housing stock and some of the benefits, sustainability of that method of construction. They're quite hard to repeat that nowadays with no local quarrying and the like. So that's an interesting one. So I'm just moving on then quickly. Here's a question that's maybe a slightly bigger picture one. So when it comes to sustainable construction and energy efficiency retrofits, how much should the government be leading by example, and what would that look like? And I'll preface this by saying, you know, Jersey has set itself its own targets for government buildings, having EPCs in place for later on this decade, and they're trying to put in place other areas where they're leading on when it comes to their built environment that they own themselves. So what should government be leading by example, and what would that look like? Paul, do you want to comment on that one?
Well, certainly, I think with its own building stock and with anything else that it builds, it needs to lead by example, certainly. And that needs to then trickle down in terms of the building rate and increasing the sustainable aspects of that.
John, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think threefold for me. One, lead by example on your own buildings, and as Victoria said earlier, the standards are not necessarily just a minimum, so build well over spec like the GHA do. I think the second thing is look at the building regulations for the island. We'd love to think that everybody tries to do the right thing and goes over spec, but that very rarely happens. That's why it's happening slowly now. So we have to force that change through increased regulations. And then the third thing is, you know, for me, education is still massive, and whatever that looks like, I think the government's got a part to play in that as well as the retailers and people selling the materials and the trade itself. So I think it's threefold for me.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the panel in a second on this point. I know other people have got other things to say. There's a lady at the back there who has a question or a statement around this.
Yes, it's going back to the dilapidated buildings. I just wanted to know what the procedure is when people don't apply for planning permission on those dilapidated buildings, when there's no planning being applied for. What is the thoughts around that? They're just allowed to, you know, continue to get dilapidated.
We'll send that straight to planning as they own the house.
Funny you should say this. I'm really proud of this piece of work that's actually going on at the moment, and it's due to be submitted tomorrow. At the moment, you cannot do anything. You cannot make anybody change the dilapidated property and sort of like make it better. But we're just bringing out something, and touch wood, it'll go through the states, is section 46 of the land and planning. And that will look at really dilapidated / derelict places and say that you actually have to do something about it. Now, there's various ways that you can do it, and we'll give people have a lot of options. But if they don't choose to do it and it goes right through the process, they will actually get a criminal conviction. So it's going to make people think about things. And if they don't want to do it, it's absolutely fine. The states can do the work. And if they don't want that, they've always got the opportunity to sell it. But we've got a number of properties on the island that are derelict. We've got roughly around 170 homes that could actually be housing people that are just sitting vacant.
Okay, so there's definitive change happening there at the moment. And it sounds like that's a hot topic right now. Lindsay de Sausmarez?
Thanks. I'm just jumping. I'm also really supportive of that bit of work we fed into it. Thank you very much. It's great. I'm just hopping back to the previous question about should the states lead by example. My view is absolutely categorically yes, and we are doing that. We've actually within our climate change policy got an action, a pillar, I can't remember exactly what it is, but one of the main thrusts of our climate change policy in terms of its implementation is exactly that. It's the states leading by example. And I would say that I completely agree in terms of building standards. It's something Victoria and I have had conversations about, but new build is such a small percentage of our building stock in the island. And I think we forget as well, you know, we think of the big civic buildings, but actually the states own something like, I'm going to get this number wrong, I want to say 1,600 social rental houses, for example. And I think it's fair to say Nick at the back of the room would have a much more technical view of this, but you know, they were built in the post-war decades, and they are not shining examples of energy efficiency. So we have got a bit of work that joins up those two committees and is looking at what we can do with our own housing stock as well as other states' property. And states' property takes many different forms, but I just wanted to reassure people that that is something we're actively pursuing.
Okay, thank you very much, Lindsay. And I think Nick wants to come in on that one as well.
Thank you. I was hoping to hide at the back. Yes, so sorry, I work for the DPA as a conservation and design officer. So we advise the planning department on all of these sorts of issues. And I've been asked by Environment and Infrastructure, so that's Lindsay over there, to look at the energy efficiency in houses in, buildings in Guernsey. So this whole topic is something that we have been looking into and are working towards producing a policy paper in the middle of next year, or hopefully earlier than that, actually. So yes, all of these issues are something that's come up and we are currently researching. And I can talk about each part of this really. It's interesting, I think, coming back to EPCs, it's interesting to think about it in terms of climate pledges and net zero by 2050 and things like that, because then that suddenly makes the purpose of EPCs and understanding this kind of thing, it gives a purpose for it rather than there being downsides in terms of the cost of producing these things. If you look at it as a requirement that everybody needs to up their game and work towards this kind of thing, then there is a requirement to understand it. And currently we don't really understand the amount of carbon that is in buildings in Guernsey. So we need to have these things in order to understand them and to work forwards in bettering them. That includes EPCs. You do what's known as a SAP assessment, which is a standard energy, oh, I can't remember off the top of my head, sorry. Standard assessment procedure. That's
Can I just interrupt quickly? Sorry.
Yep.
Victoria's got to leave. She's got
Open planning meeting.
Open planning meeting she absolutely needs to go to. So she's not running off, and she's available by email, but she does have to go now. So sorry to interrupt you, Nick, but she's going to go now, just so you know why she's going. Back to you, Nick. Please carry on. Sorry about that. So we're at SAP, I think, weren't we?
Yeah, so EPCs rely on SAP assessments, which allows you to understand the amount of carbon in a building. or, how that works. So in terms of reaching net zero at any point in the future, these things, whilst they are possibly difficult and they require new sectors, are necessary, I think. At least not necessarily SAP, but some system which is in a similar vein to SAP, because there's lots of different ways of assessing these things. But SAP is the way that the UK government do it, and we have a lot of ties with them, and it would fit into place quite easily. And that also brings into, well, green finance is part of that as well, because they all work together as three EPCs, SAP and green finance work together as three things where you can encourage the betterment of the majority of the buildings that actually, so Victoria was talking about focusing on the right buildings. And currently, again, we don't know which buildings to focus on. And it's about collecting that data. So you don't want to necessarily focus on protected buildings because it's a small group of buildings which have high significance and are very, you need to treat them carefully. You don't necessarily need to focus on modern buildings because if they've been built in the last 15 years, they're probably going to be okay. So it's buildings, so REBA in the UK work on buildings that are interwar generally because they're the poorest performing buildings. So we have to identify those buildings through these processes and try and help people do what is known as the fabric first approach to retrofitting. So retrofitting is the key, and it's difficult to get people to retrofit their buildings because they're living there and they're their houses and everything. So encouraging retrofit, I think, is the key to this whole debate.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. So there's a strong case there for the importance of, in some way, driving retrofit within our existing housing stock within that specific time period, which is really useful. How that happens, I think, is something that is quite at the core of what we're talking about here. But the how is tricky and multidimensional. I think we've got time for a few more questions. So I'm going to put one out there right now. So we've heard a lot about the problems we have and the barriers we have to being more sustainable. I'm going to put it to the panel and perhaps to the audience as well. What is Guernsey actually doing well in this space already when it comes to sustainability and in particular the built environment? So Richard, can I come to you on that one first?
I previously said DHA, I think, are our shining light.
Yeah.
They're going above and beyond what they need to do. The other with the GE are doing a lot of things well with all the solar panel projects that they're putting out there. Can't think of too much point.
Okay, that's all right. John, have you got a perspective there?
I can't really add many identifiable bodies to that, but I think just generally, I feel there's a real groundswell now on this subject, and people like yourselves being in the room, I think it's really starting to gain momentum. I think we've got some catch up to do, but I think there's a real desire now starting to build in the community. Is the one thing that is going to force this through if we stick with it.
So perhaps there's more of a mandate for politicians to drive further and faster, perhaps, given some of the interest.
Yeah, I think so, definitely.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, just to reiterate what was said then, really, I think there's a general movement in the right direction and it needs to be kind of pushed along a bit faster and harder.
So more, faster. You heard it here first. Okay.
Rollo, sorry, if I could just add that to Nick's point at the back of the room. I think when he talks about net zero, I mean, for me, the building regs and the materials and all the education, that's all how we do it. I think the net zero really has given countries and communities a reason why to do this and to understand there's a bigger picture to all this. So I think we need something similar like that. It's not just here are the regs, you've got to conform. This is net zero. This is when we're trying to get there. And why wouldn't you want to be part of that?
Has anyone got from the audience got any perspectives on things Guernsey are doing well in this space? They want to chip in? It's fine if you don't. Okay. One of the questions I wanted to put to you is there seems to be a lot of carbon tied up in the knockdown and rebuild. So as a combination, that seems to be a huge number when you look at the footprint of that. Should more emphasis be put on durability of materials or perhaps keeping some of the buildings we already have? Yeah, Richard, Farnham.
disagree with what Nick said earlier, actually. Normally, when a building is getting towards end of life, it's not just the fabric that's not performing well. The plumbing, heating, electrics all need replacing. The roof probably leaks, and kitchen and bathrooms need stripping out. And actually, the difference between doing that and keeping an existing shell and deciding to knock that shell down and start all over again, you will get a building, if you start again, that fits your need and is completely fit for purpose. Whereas if you try and refurb an existing shell, you will end up with a bit of a camel.
But should we be looking for more durable replacements when we're speccing those rebuilds?
Well, provided you can recycle your materials, your timbers and your concrete, then you are reducing the environmental harm by reusing those materials.
So maybe more of that on island. John, do you have a perspective on that, on the rebuilds and the cost of those carbon perspective?
Yeah, I think, Norman Piette, we sell the high quality brands and we go for those materials that are going to last longer and have greater performance. But, there's so much pressure on price and cost that, quite often people make a more economic or economically viable decision for them at the moment in time. But I think we've got to remember, if you're putting energy efficient materials into your house, no matter what that looks like, it's going to show you a saving down the line. And most of these materials now are becoming so efficient, they'll show you greater savings. So it's got to be seen as an investment. So for me, yeah, you can have higher durable materials. It will come at a cost, but you've got to look beyond that initial cost, really.
Okay, great, thank you. Paul, anything you want to add there?
I think you have to look at each project in its own right. And so every time I look at a building that is to be extended or revamped, you have to see whether it's worth maintaining the shell or maintaining different elements of it. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not cost effective. And I think, again, it comes back, you have to be pragmatic and practical. And at the end of the day, cost is a big part of it, whether it's that initial capital cost to create a new house, or if you're looking at the longer term overall life cycle costs of the building. So you have to be realistic in that approach.
Okay. And anyone from the audience have a perspective on that? Yeah. Can we have the mic up here, please? So we'll have this one, and then we'll probably go to our closing remarks on that.
Yeah, hi, I'm Harry from Guernsey Ports. Thank you. It's been really interesting to hear all the discussions. There's something that was mentioned right at the beginning about client demand, and I think education has just been a constant theme that's come through this. We at Guernsey Ports have a responsibility, I think, to lead by example. We can't expect as a States area to see the community doing anything different to what we would do. But the simple fact is we don't always know. We don't know what we don't know. That education piece is so important, and it's not as accessible as it might or could be. And I think we'd really encourage any area of the industry and the sector to continue to foster that education. I'd want to be able to go into a meeting, an initial meeting, to talk about a new development, and the first thing on the agenda to be, what is the right thing to do here? We're about to take a very, very long-term decision. It's a legacy that we're going to be leaving behind us, and we're only custodians of this estate at this point in time. We're not the ultimate owners forever. So we've got to make the right decisions, and we need the industry to really push us to make those right decisions. I'd genuinely welcome any sort of progressive thinking in that area.
So yeah, I think that's a really important point about a long-term perspective on things does tend to drive a more sustainable perspective, and so perhaps more long-termism in our planning and thinking, especially from the clients, and whether they be government or business or individuals. Okay, well, thank you everyone for that. I'm just going to ask our panel one more question. Guernsey seems to need more affordable housing, need those constructions to be as sustainable and energy efficient as possible, and needs expertise to deliver those things, as we've heard many times today. What is the number one thing Guernsey should do to move on and drive this forward? So to each of the panel, Paul, can I start with you? Just one thing.
Just
or
one
maybe,
thing.
or maybe two.
Okay. I think it's joined up. The whole process to be joined up from the initial planning through the design, basically where I started at the start of this seminar. And it needs to be coordinated amongst everyone.
So everyone pulling in the same direction.
Yeah.
There's still some
It
coordination.
comes down to education, basically.
Who owns the coordination then, to play devil's advocate there?
I think architects are the
Architects. Architects leading the charge on that one. Okay. John, where are you?
I don't think it's going to happen without legislation, to be honest. I think, you know, we all talk the talk and we all go so far, but leaving it to its own devices, it only gets so far. And that's where we are today. Some people are very keen to do it. Not enough people are keen to do it. So I think it needs something forming from the government to look at this as a subject, pulling all the different bodies together and making it happen.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Richard?
I agree with John as saying, you know, everyone wants to change the world. No one wants to change themselves. And so it's getting the Part L standards up to the matching the UK. And there's no reason we can't do that, because everyone in the UK, where we buy all our materials from and import a lot of our skills from, are already doing it. If there's a thing over finance and, you know, getting something that where the states could actually offer loans at low interest for people to invest in solar energy or other energy saving measures, could solve that problem as well.
Thank you very much, Richard. So what we're hearing here from the panel is, I think, a call to arms really for each of us as individuals and business owners and voters to take action ourselves and demand more sustainable action, demand it sooner, and to take responsibility for our own areas as much as trying to drive change in other areas as well. There's a call for education and a greater need for that on the island within the construction sector. But I think when we look at sustainability in the round, that's true of all the sectors, you know, the finance sector, the commercial sector. There is a knowledge gap and we need to invest in that. And I think that the biggest takeout is that there's a real appetite for greater action and speed of action in this space. And I think if there's one thing that kind of has surfaced out of this, is perhaps that we need to move on that sooner rather than later. And we have a collective responsibility on that. So thank you very much to our panel and thank you very much to the audience. I think we'll close there. So thank you very much.